Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now let's dive into the stories. It had been a long year of relentless work. My friend and I had been pushing ourselves to the limit, juggling deadlines, meetings, and endless emails. The pressure was unbearable at times, and we knew we needed a break. So, after much planning, we decided to take a week off to disconnect, breathe, and recharge. A camping trip was the perfect idea. It was simple, far from technology, and offered the peace we desperately needed. We packed up our gear and drove out to the mountains. The roads were empty, the trees thick on either side, and the quiet hum of our engine was the only sound. We both agreed that the noise and bustle of the city had been wearing on us for months. A week in nature sounded like the ideal escape. After hours of driving, we reached the campsite. It was secluded, nestled deep in the forest. The air was crisp, fresh, and smelled of pine and earth. We unloaded our backpacks and set up our tents, working in a comfortable silence. Once everything was set, we gathered some wood for a fire. It didn't take long for the crackling flames to bring warmth, casting flickering shadows on the trees around us. We sat by the fire, eating simple meals and talking about everything and nothing. The night was peaceful, the only sounds the occasional crack of wood in the fire and the distant rustle of animals in the underbrush. It felt like the world had stopped. No deadlines, no phones, just the hum of nature around us. The plan for the next day was simple. We were going to climb the nearby mountain, something neither of us had done in years. The thought of getting to the top, seeing the world from above, was enough to bring some excitement. But as the night grew darker, a strange unease began to settle in. I noticed at first, a faint whisper in the wind as if someone was calling from the forest. I dismissed it, telling myself it was just the wind. But my friend seemed uneasy too. He kept looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to step out of the shadows. We both tried to brush it off, focusing on the fire and the warmth it provided. After a while, the air grew colder, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch further. It felt as if the forest was watching us, its silence deafening. I suggested we turn in for the night, and we both retreated to our tents, zipping up tightly. The wind outside was picking up, and the trees groaned as if under strain. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing faint sounds outside, like someone walking around our campsite. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too close. They circled the camp, and every time I heard them, my heart raced. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind playing tricks, but the sounds were unmistakable. Suddenly there was a loud crack. The sound of a branch breaking near the tents. My friend's voice was low, trembling when he called out, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my throat dry. "Stay quiet. Maybe it's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. The sounds continued, growing louder, closer. Someone or something was out there. And the worst part? It wasn't just walking. It was as if something was trying to sneak around us to see if we were awake. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, straining our ears to hear anything, waiting for the next movement. Eventually the footsteps stopped, and for a while the forest was still again. But the fear that had settled in my chest wouldn't leave. In the morning the air was thick with fog. The campsite looked the same as when we had gone to sleep, but there was something off. The fire pit was disturbed, the logs rearranged. It was as if someone had been there after we had gone to sleep. I felt a knot in my stomach, but we decided to go ahead with our plan to climb the mountain. We packed up our things, but something told me we were being watched. The trek up was grueling, but it wasn't the physical exertion that bothered me. It was the overwhelming sense that we were not alone. About halfway up the trail we stopped for a break. That's when we noticed something strange in the distance, a figure standing motionless in the fog. It was too far to make out any details, but it was clearly a person. But there was something wrong about the way they stood, unnaturally still, like they were waiting for us. My friend reached for his phone, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. The figure didn't move, just stared in our direction. It wasn't until we started walking again that it finally vanished, fading into the mist like it had never been there at all. That night, as we made camp again, the fear that had been gnawing at me grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted, that something was out there watching our every move. We decided to pack up early the next morning, heading back down the mountain and away from the strange presence that had plagued us. But as we reached the base of the mountain, we discovered something that left us both shaken. Our car was gone. Just gone. Panic set in immediately. Our car, the one we had driven so far to get here, was nowhere to be seen. We looked around in disbelief, hoping it was some kind of mistake, maybe a trick of the fog or a momentary lapse in memory. But no matter how much we searched, the car was simply gone. The parking area was empty except for the scattered debris and the remnants of old leaves, like the entire vehicle had been lifted from the earth. "Are you sure we parked it here?" my friend asked, his voice tight with anxiety. I nodded, trying to keep my calm. "This is the spot. We've only been gone for a few hours." It didn't make sense. There was no one else here. No other cars, no other campers. The road we had traveled on was too remote for anyone to have just driven by and taken it. I felt a cold sweat creeping up my back, my mind racing through possibilities. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling now. "This isn't right." But where could we go? We were miles from the nearest town, no phone signal, and no way to call for help. We had no choice but to walk back to the nearest road and hope for someone to pass by. The fog was thicker now, wrapping around us like a blanket. The trees, which had once looked so beautiful, now seemed oppressive, their dark forms looming over us as we trudged through the forest. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig made us jump. We weren't alone, I knew it. Whatever had taken our car was still out there, and it was watching us. After hours of walking, we came across a small cabin, barely visible through the mist. The sight of it filled me with a strange mix of hope and dread. We knocked on the door, half expecting no answer, but to our surprise, it opened slowly. An older man stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. His clothes were worn and faded, and his face was weathered from years of living in isolation. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice raspy but calm. We were camping," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We came back and our car is gone. We need help." He studied us for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You're not the first to come through here like that," he said after a long pause. "Happens more often than you'd think." My friend and I exchanged a glance. "What do you mean?" The man hesitated, then stepped aside to let us in. We entered cautiously, grateful for shelter, but the inside of the cabin was even more unsettling than the outside. The walls were lined with old photographs, yellowed with age, of people we didn't recognize. There were strange symbols painted on the wooden floors and a thick, musty smell in the air. "You should have never come here," the man said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "This place. It draws people in, makes them think they're escaping. But it's all a trap. Those things you've been hearing out there. They're not animals. And they're not just wandering the forest." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. "The forest has a way of taking what it wants," the man said, his eyes distant. "It feeds on fear, on desperation. The ones who come out here, they think they're safe. They think they can leave whenever they want. But the forest doesn't let you go that easily. Once it's claimed you, you don't leave." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you saying we're trapped here?" The man nodded slowly. "More or less. You'll start seeing things. Things that aren't really there but feel too real to ignore. You'll hear them following you, whispering your name. You'll think you're just tired, that it's all in your head. But it's not." I swallowed hard, trying to process what he was saying. It all felt so surreal, but every instinct in my body was telling me he wasn't lying. "We can't leave without our car," my friend said, his voice shaking. "We need to go back." "You can try," the man said with a shrug. "But the road's not the same once you get past the trees. Trust me, I've been here a long time. And I've seen too many leave only to come back. They never come back the same." I felt my stomach twist in knots. What had we gotten ourselves into? The cabin was starting to feel more like a prison, the man's warnings echoing in my mind. But what else could we do? We couldn't just sit here and wait for whatever was out there to find us. That night we decided to rest, but sleep didn't come. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The sound of footsteps in the forest returned, closer now. I could hear whispers in the darkness, as though someone, something, was standing just outside the door, waiting for us to make the first move. I turned to my friend, my heart pounding. "We have to go. We can't stay here." But when we stepped outside, the mist had thickened, and the trees had closed in around us. The path we had walked earlier was now gone, replaced by an endless sea of trunks and branches. No road. No cabin in sight. And then from the mist, a figure appeared. The figure emerged slowly from the dense fog, its outline barely visible against the pale gray of the morning. At first, I thought it was just another person, maybe a fellow camper or someone lost like we were. But as the figure drew closer, I could feel my heart skip a beat. It wasn't a person. At least, not in any way that I could understand. The shape was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its features hidden by the thick mist, but I could feel its presence, cold, unnerving. The air around it seemed to grow colder, a sharp, biting chill that made my breath catch in the back of my throat. We stood frozen, unsure whether to run or to wait, hoping it would disappear like a bad dream. But it didn't. The figure stopped a few feet from us, its head tilting in a way that made it clear it was studying us, assessing us like prey. Its eyes, dark, hollow, and deep, locked onto mine, and I felt an icy shiver crawl up my spine. There was something wrong with the way it looked at me, something ancient and predatory. My friend was the first to move, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is that? What is it?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth had gone dry and my legs felt weak as though they were no longer my own. The figure remained still, its eyes never leaving us, and I realized it was waiting for something. Waiting for us to make a move. "Run," I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. "We need to get away." We turned and sprinted into the fog, not knowing where we were going, just knowing we had to get away from whatever that thing was. The forest around us felt different now, more oppressive, like the trees themselves were closing in, their branches reaching down to grab us. The fog thickened, swirling around us, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Behind us we heard it. The soft, slow footsteps, like the sound of something following us, never in a rush but always there. It was too quiet, too deliberate. It wasn't chasing us, not in the way a person would. It was toying with us. We ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast we moved, it felt like we weren't getting anywhere. The same trees, the same fog, everything looked the same. We were stuck, trapped in the same spot, as though the forest itself was a maze, a living thing that was keeping us from escaping. Suddenly, I felt my foot catch on something. I stumbled, falling forward, my hands hitting the ground hard. My friend stopped, reaching out to help me up, but the moment his hand touched mine, I felt a cold, heavy pressure push down on my chest, as if something invisible was pressing me into the earth. I looked up at him, panic in my eyes. "Get up. We need to keep moving." But he didn't respond. His eyes were wide, staring at something behind me. When I turned, I saw it. The figure was standing just a few feet away, its shadow stretching toward us, its hollow eyes glowing in the fog like black holes. And this time it wasn't still. It was moving toward us, slowly but surely, with a purpose that filled the air with dread. I grabbed my friend's arm, pulling him to his feet. "We have to go. Now." We ran again, but this time there was no mistaking it, we were being hunted. The footsteps behind us grew louder, closer, and I knew without a doubt that we wouldn't make it much longer. My legs burned from exhaustion, but there was no choice. We couldn't stop. And then, just as we rounded a corner of trees, we saw it, our campsite. The familiar tents, the campfire, the remnants of the night before. We had made it back. But it wasn't the same. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The forest around us seemed quieter, too quiet, as if even the animals were holding their breath. We stopped, gasping for air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had we made it? Was the figure gone? Suddenly, I heard a soft whisper, barely audible, like a voice carried by the wind. My blood ran cold as I realized it was speaking. My name. Come. Closer. I turned, but no one was there. The forest, the fog, it all seemed to close in on us, suffocating, pressing us into the campsite. I grabbed my friend's arm. "We have to leave. Now." But as we turned to go, we froze. The car. It was there, parked at the edge of the campsite, just as it had been before. I couldn't believe it. It hadn't been there when we left, and yet now it was exactly where it had been before we lost it. Did you see that?" my friend asked, his voice shaky. I nodded, too afraid to speak. We ran to the car, but as I reached for the door handle, I noticed something strange. The windows were fogged up, the doors were locked, and a faint eerie reflection of the forest seemed to shimmer inside. Before I could open the door, a voice spoke again, louder this time, but not from outside. It was inside the car. "Don't leave. Not yet." I turned to my friend, my mind spinning with fear. This wasn't just a forest. It wasn't just a campsite. Something was here, something that didn't want us to leave. And if we did, we would never truly leave. I felt my heart race, the words echoing in my head like a curse. "Don't leave. Not yet." The voice wasn't just an eerie whisper anymore. It was clear, as if it were speaking directly to us from inside the car. We froze, staring at the fogged windows, trying to make sense of what we were hearing, what we were seeing. I reached for the door again, but my hand was trembling. "Stay calm," I told my friend, though my own voice betrayed me, thin and shaky. We had to get out of here, had to leave this place before whatever was watching us could do something worse. But before we could make another move, the fog around us thickened, swirling in unnatural patterns, as if the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. The trees seemed to bend closer, their twisted branches reaching toward us like skeletal hands. The air felt heavy, thick with something oppressive, something ancient. The voice, no, the presence was everywhere now, seeping into our minds, pulling at our fear, making it impossible to think straight. And then the car door opened by itself. Slowly, creaking as if the very air around it was reluctant to allow it. We stood there, rooted to the spot, too terrified to move. Inside the car, it was as though the world outside had frozen, dark, still, with the faintest reflection of our frightened faces in the fogged-up windows. But there, in the rearview mirror, something else appeared. It wasn't our reflection. No, this was something else, something wrong. A pale, twisted figure, its face an unreadable mask of agony and rage, stared back at us. Its eyes were wide and hollow like black pits, and its mouth was open in a silent scream. I could feel it, feel the weight of its gaze pulling me in, reaching for me, pulling me into the reflection, into whatever it was that had taken our car, our sanity, and now seemed to want our souls. Without thinking, I grabbed my friend's arm and yanked him toward the woods. "We have to go now." We ran, no more hesitation, no more questioning, just raw survival instinct, pushing us through the thickening fog, pushing us away from whatever horror that thing inside the car was. We didn't look back, not even once. The sounds of the forest had become a cacophony of whispers, of footsteps, of unseen eyes watching from every direction. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, the forest floor slippery with the wetness of the mist, but we didn't care. We had to get out. We didn't stop until the first light of dawn broke through the fog, casting long shadows over the trees. That's when we stumbled upon the road, the one we had driven on earlier. We didn't care about the car anymore. We didn't care if it was waiting for us back at the campsite, or if it had disappeared again. All we wanted was to be away, to feel the sun on our faces, to be anywhere but here. A few hours later, we found ourselves at a small diner, the smell of coffee and greasy food a welcome comfort. We sat down, still in shock, trying to process what had happened. We couldn't talk about it, not yet. But we both knew. We both knew the forest had taken something from us. It had changed us. And no matter how much time passed, no matter how far we went, we would never be the same. Because the voice, the presence, it hadn't left us. I could still hear it, whispering faintly in the back of my mind. "Don't leave. Not yet." And deep down, I knew it wasn't done with us. It would never be done. It started as a weekend escape, a break from work, the city, and the endless noise. Greg, Mike, and their wives, Lisa and Karen, had been planning this camping trip for months. They wanted solitude, nature, and the simple joy of a campfire under the stars. They chose Lake Hollow, a remote camping spot deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. It had once been a popular site, but over the years, fewer people visited. Rumors circulated about people disappearing, but no one ever found evidence of foul play. Just stories. The drive was long, winding through dense woods and up narrow dirt roads. By the time they arrived, the sun was already sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lake. They set up their tents, collected firewood, and settled in for the night. As the fire crackled, they laughed, drank, and reminisced about their college years. But as the night deepened, a strange stillness settled over the woods. No wind. No rustling leaves. Even the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, frogs, distant owls, had faded. Karen was the first to notice. "Why is it so quiet?" she whispered. The others listened. The silence felt unnatural, pressing in on them like a weight. Then from the darkness beyond the fire's glow, came a noise. A slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. Footsteps. Greg grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing. Just endless blackness between the trunks. "Probably a deer," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. Lisa shivered. "Let's just go to bed." They retreated to their tents, zipping them up tight. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then around 2 a.m. Karen's scream shattered the night. Greg and Mike burst out of their tents to find her standing in the clearing, pale as a ghost. "There was someone outside our tent," she gasped. "I heard breathing. Right next to me." Mike scanned the area with his flashlight, but the woods swallowed the beam. "Let's just pack up in the morning and leave," he muttered. They returned to their tents, but sleep was impossible. Every crack of a branch, every distant rustle sent a spike of fear through them. Hours crawled by. Then just before dawn Greg heard it. A whisper. Low, guttural, right outside his tent flap. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Something was speaking to him. His breath hitched. He reached for his flashlight with a trembling hand and unzipped the tent an inch. Two eyes stared back. Not human. Wide, black, too reflective. Greg's scream woke the others. They scrambled out, grabbing whatever weapons they could, knives, a hatchet. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows, and beyond its glow stood a figure. Tall. Motionless. The moment their eyes locked on it, it stepped backward into the trees, disappearing without a sound. The four of them didn't waste a second. They grabbed their gear, throwing whatever they could into the truck. As the engine roared to life, Karen looked back at the campsite. In the dirt near the fire, something had been written. One word. Stay. They never went camping again. The drive back to town was silent. No one spoke, no music played, and the only sound was the tires crunching on the dirt road. Greg's hands were locked on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Every so often, Karen or Lisa glanced out the windows, checking the tree line. The feeling of being watched hadn't left them. When they finally reached the highway, Mike exhaled loudly. What the hell was that? No one answered. They didn't know. By the time they reached their homes, exhaustion took over. No one unpacked. No one texted each other goodnight. They just locked their doors and collapsed into uneasy sleep. The scratches. The next morning, Greg stepped outside to grab his duffel bag from the truck. That's when he saw it. Scratches. Long, deep claw marks ran down the side of the vehicle. Not random either. They formed a word. Stay. Greg stumbled back, his heart pounding. He fumbled for his phone and snapped a picture, then called Mike. Check your truck, he said, voice tight. Pause. Then Mike muttered, shit. Within minutes they were all on a group call. Mike's SUV had the same scratches. So did Karen and Lisa's cars. This isn't over, Lisa whispered. The watcher. That night, Greg couldn't sleep. His bedroom window faced the street, and every so often he swore he saw something, someone standing just beyond the streetlights. Not moving. Just watching. At 2:13 a.m. his phone buzzed. A text from Mike. It's outside. Greg bolted upright. His pulse hammered. He typed back, what? Mike sent a picture. It was blurry, taken through a window, but there was no mistaking it. A tall, dark figure stood in his yard, just beyond the porch light. Its eyes, wide, black, reflecting the light, stared straight at the camera. Another message came through. We never should have left. Greg swallowed hard. His phone vibrated again. New message. Not from Mike. Not from anyone in his contacts. Just an unknown number. A single word. Stay. Greg's hands shook as he stared at the message. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy. Every instinct screamed at him to throw his phone across the room, but he forced himself to type a response. Who is this? The message showed as read, but no reply came. Then outside his window something moved. A shadow. Tall. Motionless. Standing in the same spot he'd seen movement before. Greg's stomach clenched. His mind raced. He had two choices, run or confront whatever this was. His fingers curled around the baseball bat beside his bed. He wasn't a fighter, but he wasn't going to just sit there. Heart pounding, he crept toward the front door. The house was silent. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight. As he reached the door, he took a breath, counted to 3 and yanked it open. Nothing. Just the cold night air and an empty street. His breath fogged in the air as he stepped onto the porch, bat raised. The streetlights flickered. The silence pressed down on him. Then he saw them. Scratch marks. On his front door. The same word as before. Stay. His stomach turned to ice. His phone buzzed again. Mike. Lisa's missing. Her door was open when I got here. No sign of her. Greg's vision blurred. His pulse roared in his ears. Then another text. From the unknown number. One by one. The descent. Greg didn't think. He ran. Jumping into his truck, he peeled out of the driveway, tires screeching. He called Mike, who answered on the first ring. She was here, Mike said, voice frantic. Her phone's on the floor. Her shoes are here. It's like she just vanished. Call the police, Greg said, turning onto Mike Street. I did. What did they say? Mike was quiet for a long time. Then. They're still looking for Karen. Greg nearly slammed on the brakes. What? She's missing too. Greg's mind reeled. Just hours ago, Karen was fine. She had texted in the group chat talking about how freaked out she was. And now she was gone. Mike's house came into view. Greg jumped out of the truck before it even stopped. He ran inside, finding Mike standing in the living room, staring at something on the wall. A message carved deep into the paint. You left. They stayed. Greg turned, his breath coming in short gasps. What does that mean? Mike's face was pale. Greg followed his gaze to Lisa's phone, lying face up on the floor. The screen was on, a single message displayed. From Lisa's number. A photo. Greg picked up the phone, his hands trembling as he opened it. The image loaded. A campfire. Burning low. Beyond the flames stood 2 figures. Lisa and Karen. Their faces were blank. Eyes black. And behind them in the shadows was something else. Something tall. Watching. Waiting. The message below the image was short. Come back. The fire inside Greg's gut turned to ice. Mike swallowed hard. We have to go back. Greg's pulse roared in his ears. Every part of him screamed no. But deep down he already knew. They had no choice. The return. By the time they reached Lake Hollow, it was past midnight. The fire was still burning. Greg and Mike stepped into the clearing, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The campsite looked untouched, as if they had never left. Then from the trees they heard it. A whisper. Oh, guttural. Calling their names. Then another sound. Footsteps. Slow. Coming closer. Greg's grip tightened around his flashlight. Lisa and Karen emerged from the shadows. Their faces were blank. Eyes wide, dark, reflecting the firelight. Mike took a step forward. Lisa? No response. Greg's breath caught as he noticed something. Their feet weren't touching the ground. A shiver crawled down his spine. He stepped back. This isn't them. Karen's mouth moved, but the voice wasn't hers. It was deeper. Hollow. You left. Lisa tilted her head, her voice overlapping with Karen's. We stayed. The air around them grew heavy. The fire dimmed. The trees seemed to close in. Then just beyond the light, the shadow moved. Tall. Silent. Watching. Greg grabbed Mike's arm. Run. They turned and sprinted, branches whipping at their faces. The whispering followed. The footsteps. Then the final message. Carved into a tree at the edge of the woods. You can leave, but you'll never be free. They never spoke about that night again. And they never went back. But sometimes in the dead of night when Greg is alone, he still hears the whispers. The end.